Your king shall arise. Daniel chapter 11, verse 3. Alexander and his successors. Students of the Bible often overlook the story of Alexander the Great's conquest of the eastern territories of the Mediterranean and its aftermath because it belongs to the period between the Testaments. Nevertheless, this story had ramifications for Judea and for Jewish identity that were no less profound than the Babylonian exile. So, a proper understanding of the Judaism from which Jesus and the early Christian movement emerged depends upon a thorough exploration of this period. One Old Testament text, however, shows a special interest in this story, and that is the book of Daniel, especially the visions that occupy the second half of that book. Scholars continue to consider different models for the composition of Daniel. Some read it as a book written entirely during the period of the exile, during the lifetime of the historical Daniel. Others, among them some committed evangelicals, believe that the apocalyptic visions are better explained as a product of the 2nd century BC. Scholars on both sides of this conversation, however, agree that the focus of Daniel's prophecies falls on events of the Hellenistic period. Daniel chapter 8 presents a vision of the defeat of the Persian armies by the forces of Greece. The latter is portrayed by a goat with a great horn, identified as its first king in chapter 8, verse 21. This great horn, the symbol of the Greek nation's power, was none other than Alexander the Great, who first defeated King Darius III of Persia and made all of Persia, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Palestine a part of the Greek Empire. At the age of 33, Alexander died of a fever as he was returning from his eastern conquests. He was not succeeded by his natural son. Rather, his principal generals entrenched themselves in various parts of his empire. As Daniel relates in chapter 8, verse 8, there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven, none of them enjoying Alexander's dominion or power. The actual situation following Alexander's death was far more complicated than we might imagine from just reading Daniel. A 4-way division didn't really emerge until several decades later. For the people of Judea, the 2 most important of Alexander's successors were to be found to their immediate south and north. Ptolemy Lagus was one of Alexander's own generals who seized Egypt and Palestine very early in the struggle and remained securely there for the rest of his life, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. All of his heirs would bear the name Ptolemy as well. Seleucus Nicator was one of Ptolemy's generals who rose to independent power with Ptolemy's support and came to rule the largest slice of Alexander's kingdom. Daniel refers to him in chapter 11, verse 5. The king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger and shall rule a realm greater than his own realm. Seleucus gained control of Syria and all of the territory of Babylon. His own descendants would also seize most of Asia Minor. After his murder, his kingdom passed to his son, Antiochus I Soter. All of the remaining kings of this dynasty would bear one of these 2 names. Antiochus I began an unsuccessful campaign against Egypt in the hope of expanding his territory into Palestine. After his own death, his son Antiochus II and Ptolemy II Philadelphus made peace. Ptolemy and his queen Arsinoe gave their daughter Berenice to Antiochus II to seal the truce, but, as Daniel relates in chapter 11, verse 6, their marriage would not last. After Berenice gave birth to a child and heir, Antiochus's ex-wife Laodice had them murdered. She then remarried Antiochus. Ptolemy III, the son of Ptolemy and Arsinoe, and brother to the murdered Berenice, sought revenge upon the king of the north. This episode is related murkily in Daniel chapter 11, verses 7 through 8. Daniel begins to give far more detailed attention to the story of the reign of Antiochus III, the grandson of Antiochus II. Antiochus III mounted 2 campaigns against Ptolemy IV of Egypt in an effort to finally seize Palestine, which had been awarded but never given to Seleucus I over a century before from the Ptolemies. He shall take a position in the beautiful land, and all of it shall be in his power. Daniel chapter 11, verse 16. Once the dust settled, Antiochus III attempted to make an alliance with Ptolemy V, giving him his daughter Cleopatra, the first queen to bear that name, as his wife. Antiochus had hoped to use his daughter to weaken Egypt, but she proved loyal to her husband and to her new country. Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I are the king and queen named in the famous Rosetta Stone, an honorary inscription written in 3 languages that would prove to be, 2 millennia later, the key to deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language. Antiochus III had 2 sons, Seleucus IV, who reigned for about 12 years, and Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV came to power in 175 BC, and his reign proved disastrous for Judea. Indeed, he is the focal point of all of Daniel's visions, and freedom from his tyranny and impact is the focal point of God's predicted interventions. He is the little horn of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, for whose rule 3 other horns, Seleucus IV and Seleucus IV's 2 sons, had to make way. This is the same little horn of Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, who set aside the orderly worship of the temple and made possible the erection of the famous abomination of desolation. Chapter 11, verses 21 through 39 give a detailed account of his attempts to conquer Egypt and his unholy actions in Judea. Under Antiochus IV, members of the Jewish priestly elite set aside the Torah as the political constitution of Jerusalem and adopted a Greek model of government instead. What began as neglect of the temple cult and the practice of Torah, however, devolved into an all-out war against Jewish piety, which came to be seen as the source of resistance to the improvements in Judea. More and more foreign soldiers were brought in. The temple itself was remade into a place of worship for the gods of the many different peoples now occupying Jerusalem. Jews who resisted and who insisted on keeping the old ways were executed. This story is told more fully in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Daniel's portrait of this king as an arrogant blasphemer is an appropriate reflection of his moniker, Antiochus Epiphaneus, or Antiochus, the divine manifestation. Such a title was perfectly normal for a Gentile king. It appears, for example, in the inscription carved into a city council chamber in Miletus, which was dedicated to this Hellenistic monarch by 2 of his clients. To a pious Jew, however, it was a symptom of the Gentile ruler's pride and godlessness. The defilement of the temple and the brutal persecution of Jews who refused to compromise their commitment to their distinctive way of life made an enormous impression on the Jewish consciousness. The result was that Antiochus IV became a kind of prototype for future arch-enemies of God and his people. His story has even left an impact on Jesus' own proclamation of the events of the end of time in Mark chapter 13. Help finally came in the form of the armed rebellion led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. Their freedom fighters finally prevailed against Antiochus IV and eventually gave Israel its first taste of political independence in over 400 years of Gentile domination. The history of this period can be found in more detail in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Apocrypha.